In this lecture, I plan to deal with how Alexander governed, administered, and taxed his empire. And this is essentially the empire that he conquered between 334 BC and early 327 BC. That is a period of about 8 years. This is the Achaemenid or Persian Empire, which had its system of satrapies, which were large provinces. A tradition of turning over local affairs to the elites of these satrapies and only exacting tribute and military service from the subject peoples. We will not really go into detail with the arrangements in India at the moment. We're going to discuss the Indian invasions, the Battle of the Hydaspes. When Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush to invade India in 327 BC, he was moving into a region that had long been outside of Persian control, and there were no Persian administrative institutions for him to build upon. So I'm going to concentrate on the regions of the former Persian Empire and discuss exactly what Alexander was doing in taxing and administering these regions. This question of how Alexander would have administered his empire when he completed his conquest, or even how he was administering it during the course of those conquests, has raised wider issues about Alexander's plans and his policies. From the start, there was a tradition in the ancient world that saw Alexander as the supreme man of action, and that his conquest wrought a new world. That world is called by modern scholars the Hellenistic world, which means Greek-like as opposed to Hellenic, which means Greek. And from 323 BC down to 30 BC, the Near East and the Greek world are known as the Hellenistic world or the Hellenistic period. And that designates the civilization wrought by the conquest of Alexander the Great. Many thought that this world was part of Alexander's overall plan. And this starts quite early, and it springs in part from the fact that Aristotle was Alexander's mentor, and that Greek philosophical writers of the Hellenistic and Roman periods saw in Alexander a decisive turning point in human affairs. Foremost were the followers of Zeno of Kition, the founder of Stoicism, who lived from 334 to 262 BC. And the Stoic doctrines became extremely popular in Rome starting in the 2nd century BC, and later influenced at least Western Christian thinking, not so much the Greek Orthodox tradition, but the Western Latin one. In these writings, Alexander emerges as the man who gave unity to mankind. To be sure, he did it through conquest, through action, through deed. But that allowed for a unity of morality and culture to emerge, a koine, a common culture. This notion caught hold in antiquity. Many thinkers saw Alexander as the start of a new age. It's captured in numerous art depictions that persist well into the Roman age. At the city of Aphrodisias in southwestern Turkey today, clearly one of the most important excavations in the Mediterranean world, and has produced more sculpture than any other excavation in the Mediterranean world. There was a villa of the philosophers uncovered to the north of the great temple of Aphrodite, who gave her name to the city. And this villa is apparently a villa of pagan philosophers of the 4th century AD, when the Roman world was becoming Christian. And they have these marvelous tondos now on display in the museum, and the matched tondo, and this was very common, the matched set of tondos show Alexander and Aristotle, the man of action, the man of thought, and revered as essentially the founders of this Stoic philosophical tradition. The villa also yielded another set of tondos of Socrates and Alcibiades, and I don't think Alcibiades is quite in the same league with Alexander in sort of his impact on world affairs, although in terms of outrageousness, Alcibiades is really second to none, except maybe the Emperor Nero. In any event, these images from antiquity, that Alexander pursued world conquest, that had some wider plan, a notion of creating a unity of mankind, or this has been picked up by modern scholars, especially since the 19th century. German scholars like to see this as a fusion policy, that is the fusion of the various races of the Near East, Verschmelzung Politik. This would be argued by those Germans who would have favored a wider German confederation, not the small Germany as created by Bismarck. W. Tarn who summed up the whole Victorian and Edwardian tradition of Alexander as the great conqueror, the noble hero, the Scottish gentleman who would have tea at 4. I'm going a little far, but not by too much. Saw in Alexander's conquests and policies an effort to do the same. He particularly stressed several events. One was the marriage of Alexander to the Iranian princesses. I discussed how important that was in winning over the Persian nobility. There is later a mass marriage in 324 BC at Susa between Macedonians and their local girlfriends, the Asian women. We're not sure what their origins are. They are probably of very mixed origin. Alexander presides over these marriages. Many of the Macedonian nobles did take high-ranking Iranian wives. Some of them resulted in successful marriages. In other cases, divorces. Could have been very often due to political reasons. But in any event, these marriages are seen as a step to creating a new unity of mankind, a removing of this distinction of Greek and barbarian, which is the fundamental distinction in the Greek world, that is those who live in a polis as opposed to those who do not live under the rule of law. The soldiers of Alexander, the veterans, carry out what is often called a mutiny at Opis in Babylonia in 324 BC, and Alexander is absolutely masterful in diffusing this mutiny, and he holds a celebration in which there's a reconciliation. Many of the Macedonians at the festival receive a drinking cup, a celebration of homonoia, concord, a word that goes back to the Pan-Hellenists. And again, all of this is usually seen as efforts to create a wider unity of mankind. This Greek philosophical tradition, these actions by Alexander to promote these marriages, the scene at Opis, to this is added a third body of evidence, and that is the establishment of Greek cities. In the course of his conquests between 334 and, say, 327 BC, Alexander established a number of important military colonies, and these evolved into Greek cities. In antiquity, close to 100 cities claimed the name Alexandria, but subsequent scholarship has pointed out that many of these were founded after the death of Alexander, and some of them actually took the name of Alexandria in order to link themselves with the great world conqueror. The colonies, these Greek military colonies, however, are rather restricted. The first such settlement is Alexandria in Egypt. It was strategic as a port. It was to replace the old Greek colony of Naucratis in the Delta. It certainly emerged as a great city, but the development of Alexandria really owed a great deal to the fact that it became the capital of Ptolemy and his successors, that is, the boyhood friend of Alexander, who turned himself into king in Egypt rather than of Egypt. He was essentially a Macedonian king ruling over Egypt and other possessions. He also was the fellow who hijacked the body of Alexander and moved it to Alexandria as a tourist attraction, and that also helped promote the growth of the city. The other cities that we know to have been established by Alexander were in the frontier areas, and I've mentioned them in the lecture dealing with the pacification of Central Asia. In some instances, these were the conversion of well-known caravan cities into Alexandria. The modern city of Merv, Margiana in antiquity, was in Alexandria. That's one case. There were Alexandrias established in Bactria and Sogdiana, one on the lower Jaxarte, still to be located, the other one on the Oxus, which we believe is likely to be Ai-Khanum, which is the name of the local site, uncovered by a French excavation team working in the 1970s and 1980s, when this whole Greek city was uncovered, and it's a marvelous, beautiful Greek city from the 4th century BC down to about 130 BC, when the Sakai moved in and sacked the place. So there are colonies, but these seem to be military colonies. These seem to be in accordance with what Philip did to secure Thrace and Illyria. They were not imposed across Asia Minor, in Syria, and certainly Iran. And so one could argue what perhaps if Alexander had had more time, he would have established these cities in the interior of his empire. That's anyone's guess. But most of the building of these Greek cities belonged to the Diadochoi, and that is the successors of Alexander. There were a series of plans of Alexander that were circulated shortly after his death. They're known by the hypomnemata, the name of the hypomnemata, which are final plans, final aims. They're recorded in Diodorus Siculus. Those plans are really rather disappointing for any kind of argument of world empire. What it calls for is an expedition to Arabia, by which Alexander means the coasts of Yemen and the areas around the Persian Gulf, to secure the sea routes from Egypt to India. There is some idea of toying with the reorganization of the Macedonian army in some way, and a good deal of it is actually spent on describing the monumental funerary buildings, mausoleum for Hephaestion, Alexander's best friend, who died in early 324 BC. So there's really very little indication among what apparently were the surviving papers of Alexander of any kind of grand scheme. And this moves me to two considerations. First is it's disappointing if one attempts to argue along the lines of scholars of the 19th and early 20th century, drawing on these philosophical traditions, that Alexander really had some kind of wider notion or unity of mankind in mind. Many of the most recent scholars have really moved away from this argument. Some have gone in the other extreme, that Alexander was nothing more than a megalomaniac, a tyrant, and virtually a totalitarian figure aiming at world domination. And I do believe those images are overdrawn. I've already discussed a bit of that. But on the other hand, it's important to look at what Alexander actually did and to look at it in the context of Macedonian and Persian history. If anything, Alexander was ever the pragmatist. In discussing some of his own notions of his divinity, even in that case, Alexander had a sense of proportion about himself. He could spoof his own divinity as well as take it seriously. Arrian and Plutarch are convinced that a lot of that was in order to rule the barbarians. Some would argue that with those concepts of being a son of Zeus, that not only it exalted him, but at the same time imposed responsibilities on him. He would have to act nobly and heroically to his Macedonian subjects as well as his new conquered subjects. And I think there's a great deal of truth to that. There was also a pragmatic end in the conquest of in the administration that was set up while conquering the Persian Empire. Let's look at a bit of what Alexander did in those 8 years of the initial campaigns to run the regions that he had overrun so quickly on the battlefield. The western half of the Persian Empire was actually the more easy area to order. In 334 BC, after the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander began to organize satrapies in Western Asia Minor. We know, for instance, that Asander, a senior officer in an important Macedonian noble, was appointed as satrap of Lydia. He replaced the Persian satrap, who had apparently fell at the Battle of Granicus. He ruled from the city of Sardis, the old Lydian royal capital. He had under him Greek mercenary soldiers. The treasury was taken over. The Lydians, however, were declared free and able to live under their own laws. This was essentially a substitution of Macedonian personnel for a Persian institution. That is, the Persian satrapy would now be replaced by Macedonians. As Alexander pushed east, he continued to appoint tested and loyal Macedonian officers in these positions, at least in the western satrapies. Now, there were some important exceptions made in Egypt, as I mentioned in passing. First, Egypt was divided into a series of different authorities, and it's a rather complicated arrangement. There were border districts that were in the hands of military men, as officers, usually members of the companion cavalry. There was a civil administration of the upper and lower kingdom. Those are the two regions of Egypt headed up by native Egyptians. But put in charge overall was a Greek from Naucratis, that is the Greek colony there, a man named Cleomenes, and his position was that as essentially of accountant, or grammateus, that is a secretary accountant. We'd call him maybe secretary treasurer. That position was very important, and it actually prefigured a number of appointments that were made in the western satrapies. Alexander's prime interest in the securing of the former Persian Empire was probably very limited. He needed provisions for his army. He needed safe passage once these areas were pacified for reinforcements to march east and join him. And we know there was a substantial number of reinforcements, especially Greek mercenaries after 330 BC, who marched east. By one count, at least 80,000 Greek mercenaries marched to join Alexander's army at some point in these 8 or 9 years. He also needed the taxation of this area, particularly to gain hard currency, to administer these provinces, and eventually to pay for the expenses of his war. That is, the Persian Empire's institutions were harnessed to fuel Alexander's heroic deeds. In 334-331 BC, besides reordering the satrapies with Macedonian officials, he imposed garrisons generally independent of the satrap under Greek or Macedonian commanders, but above all, appointed auditors or accountants, grammateus in Greek, and these were men who reported directly to Alexander. They were in charge of administering the tax collection system. They were to collect the money, and the money was vital to Alexander's army, and they were not subject to the satrap or the garrison commander within the satrapy. They reported to Alexander. And Cleomenes in Egypt was just the best documented case of this. We know that such auditors were appointed in Lydia, in the province of Cilicia, and in Syria. In Babylonia, where the first major Persian appointment was made, that's Matthias, who surrendered to Alexander after the Battle of Arbela, or Gaugamela. The man who was eventually put in charge of finances at Babylon was a boyhood friend of Alexander, Harl, who eventually absconds with large numbers of money because he's corrupt. But nonetheless, the idea was to centralize all of those treasuries and all of that money under a tested friend, a Macedonian whose loyalty would be unquestioned, to make sure the money got to the army. And these are practical arrangements you would expect of any king. I also mentioned that from 330 BC on until Alexander reaches the Indian satrapies, that Alexander appoints a number of high-ranking Persians to high office. Artabazus is satrap of Bactria and Sogdiana until he excuses himself on the grounds of old age and illness. And believe me, his career stretches back to almost 360 BC. He had served a number of Persian kings as well as Alexander. The satrap in Babylonia, Matthias, in 328 BC, apparently retires again on the same grounds. He's replaced by a Macedonian, but there's no indication that he was removed because he was a Persian or anything else. In 324 BC, when Alexander returns from India, he makes the famous march through the Gedrosian Desert. There is a major shakeup in the administration. A number of the satraps, and especially the garrison commanders who were left in the satrapies, well, they had abused their positions. They had hired many mercenary soldiers. Harpalis was the most notorious. He and his girlfriend, Pythonice, were just outrageous in Babylon, and he absconded with, 5,000 mercenaries and 6,000 talents to the Aegean world because he knew he would be punished for the corruption. Alexander punished all of his Macedonian and Greek satraps and commanders who could be proved to have been venal, abusive in their powers. Several of the Persian satraps were removed, but these were all men who were apparently implicated in an unsuccessful plot that was to carry about a rebellion in Persia shortly before Alexander returned. Several of the other satraps who were loyal, such as Darius's brother, who was they were not removed. Alexander expected of his satraps, his commanders, and his secretaries loyalty and just government, and if they did not do it, they would be removed instantly and, if necessary, punished. And so the system that Alexander applied was essentially his own personal version of that Persian administrative structure. What was all important to Alexander was appointing men he could trust. And these included Macedonians, certain Greeks who were of tested loyalty, had long served the Macedonian royal house, and members of that Persian aristocracy, including the members of the highest aristocracy from Susa, and in the border zones, for instance, his new father-in-law, the father of Roxanne, who was appointed a satrap. These would all be people who would be regarded as loyal to the crown. And you really can think of it as the crown. So this was not some sort of grand scheme to Hellenize the Near East, to establish Greek-style cities, to make all the Persians wear Greek dress, adopt Greek cults and institutions. This was just a practical way of running this vast world empire. How it would have evolved if he had lived longer than just, 33 years is anyone's guess. I should mention in passing that in the Indian provinces, the regions that Alexander would conquer in some of his hardest fighting, from 327 to 325 BC, he actually left that region sort of on hold. He had defeated some very, very powerful opponents in India, and while he did appoint satraps, power was really in the hands of the local Rajas, including a fellow Porus, who was one of Alexander's most difficult opponents, and the man who opposed him on Alexander's fourth and great battle, the Hydaspes. And my opinion is that probably in later years, Alexander would have had to return to India and really carry out some very important administrative changes there, because largely he set up loyal Indian Rajas, which was more of an expedient to organize these areas so he could return home with his Macedonians. There is another way of testing how pragmatic Alexander was in running and taxing his empire, and that is looking at a type of source that most modern historians would not take a second glance at, and that is his coinage. Coins, the serious study of coins known as numismatics, one of my specialties, and in the lectures with the teaching company, I very often make use of coins to illustrate various points. The coins issued by Alexander between 334 and 324 BC, which was largely from great stocks of specie captured from the Persians, is nothing short of astounding. And again, they point out 2 points about his running of the empire. One, the practical aims that Alexander had in mind, that is to pay his forces and his administration, to reward all of his men when they returned home in 324 BC. But also, it shows that, to a very large extent, the Hellenistic world wrought by Alexander really probably belongs more in the category of unintended consequences rather than any kind of grand master plan. That does not diminish the importance of Alexander's career, but at least it puts Alexander's actions in perspective. That he first had to conquer this world and pay for his armies before he could worry about sitting down and coming up with the kind of philosophical schemes that Stoic writers would like to talk about. Based on the sources, we know that Alexander between 334 and 330 BC, that is in less than 5 years, seized stocks of specie somewhere on the order of 235,000 talents, or the equivalent of 1.4 billion drachmae. The Greek world, and that includes in this sense the Macedonian kingdom, based its currency on silver coins. The basic silver coin was a drachma. The most common weight standard used was that of Athens, the so-called Attic weight. A drachma was 4.35 grams. 6,000 drachma made up a talent, and a talent was a measure, a weight. It was not a coin or money. And therefore, there was something on the order of 1.4 billion of these drachmae captured. Now, this included gold and silver. The vast majority of it was ingots or uncoined specie. A drachma would have been an incredibly generous wage for a day. A Greek mercenary would have been delighted to receive a drachma a day for his service. And in the 5th century BC, half a drachma would have been a good wage. It's still difficult to figure out wages in the 4th century BC. The coins that were struck from this specie were of 2 types. Primarily, Alexander struck gold coins, a didrachma, a gold stater, weighing about 8.5 grams. On its obverse was a young head of Athena, Athena Polius, that is the Athena who was the guardian of Alexander and of Achilles. On the reverse was a Nike, a victory. The silver coins carried on it a head of a young Heracles in a lion's skin, which later generations came to identify as Alexander's portrait. This was not the case. However, the Heracles was closely associated with Alexander, and on the reverse was a seated Zeus holding a scepter, and as far as I can tell, this is the first time Zeus is depicted with a scepter on any Greek coin, and it seems to be associated with the sort of imperial majesty of the great god associated with Alexander. The coins carry his name in Greek, Alexandrou. These would have been struck in multiples of the drachma, tetradrachma, and drachma. They were primarily issued in gold and silver to pay the army. As Alexander moved east across the western provinces of the Persian Empire, mints were established in Asia Minor, in Cyprus, in the cities of Phoenicia, and even eventually in Memphis, even though Egypt really didn't have a tradition of coinage. In all of these regions around the rim of the Mediterranean world, vast stocks of former Persian coins, of other types of coins, seized bullion, were turned into regal-style coins bearing the name of Alexander the Great, and bearing that head of Heracles, or in the case of the gold coins, the head of Athena. The money put into circulation by Alexander and then his successors was enormous, and the result was to monetize markets. Furthermore, fractional bronze coins, that is small change, were introduced. These carried traditional symbols: the Gorgon shield, which is the Macedonian shield, the Macedonian helmet. And these fractions, too, were struck in the western regions of the empire and entered into markets. I have been studying the coins of Gordian, where Alexander loosened the Gordian knot, and I'll be publishing the coins found at Gordian, and the evidence is dramatic. The coin finds before Alexander, starting with really from earliest coins, from the 6th century BC down to the arrival of Alexander, are very few. With the arrival of Alexander, Gordian receives large numbers of imperial-style coins of Alexander, gold and silver both, followed by the bronze fractions, and the markets of Gordian become monetized rapidly. That is, coin money becomes a feature that is used in daily transactions. That was going to be one of the consequences of taking all of this Persian specie and bullion and putting in circulation. But the prime reason and the location of these mints indicates that this was essentially for paying his costs: the fleet, the army, the administration. There are mints established at Susa in Babylon, but only late in the reign. When Alexander crossed the Euphrates and the Tigris and then moved into Iran, say in 330 BC, given his conception of the world, he believed that he would conquer the eastern regions within a matter of 2 years, and then everyone would come home and it would be over. He didn't realize that his fighting in the eastern half of the Persian Empire would be 6 years, as opposed to about 4 years in the western half. So no mints were established in the eastern satrapies. And it is still a question how those wars were funded out there. We assume that the mercenaries were paid en route. And what happened in 324 BC, there was virtually an orgy of coining gold and silver money at Babylon to pay off the army when it was discharged after their many years of service in the East. And so that the eastern satrapies, in the upper satrapies, Bactria, Sogdiana, in the Iranian satrapies, and in India, there was no effort to set up mints and to strike Greek-style coins with the name of Alexander. And again, the army was funded apparently by various expediencies, and once they returned to Susa and Babylon, much closer to the Mediterranean world, then they were paid in Alexander-style coins issued at the Mint of Babylon, and one of the great issues of the reign. And these coins continued to be minted in Alexander's name after his death and essentially become the trade coins of the ancient world. For the next 200 or 250 years, many cities and authorities issue coins in the name of Alexander because they're so well recognized. They are the international standard. But again, this was unplanned consequences. The main reason for doing this was to disseminate money to pay for the armies. Finally, I want to have a few closing remarks on the Greeks. And I've made mention of this along the way. As this empire emerges by 328, 327 BC, Alexander finds himself increasingly in an awkward position. He can run this vast empire as a king in Macedon as a traditional Macedonian king, in all the Asian possessions as the Lord of Asia, in Egypt as Pharaoh. And there are royal institutions to implement his will. But after 330 BC, what is his relationship to be with those Greek city-states? The war with Persia is over. The Pan-Hellenic War has ended. Alexander was always in a quandary how to deal with the Greeks. As he moved east and liberated Greek regions, they were not enrolled in the League of Corinth. They apparently got independent alliances with Alexander. This is true of the cities of Ionia, the Greek cities on the southern shore of Asia Minor in the region known as Pamphylia, the Greek cities on the island of Cyprus, and ultimately the Greek cities of Cyrene, that is of eastern Libya. They all apparently came in as separate allies. And the relationship between Alexander and these Greek city-states would become increasingly strained. He really could not put them under the institutions of any of his royal traditions. And the problem is that in his success of conquering the Persian Empire, he allowed the Greek city-states to recover, to amass revenues, to regain a sense of confidence. The best example is the Athenians, who during the course of Alexander's Asian expedition, under the very, very adroit administration of a man named Lycurgus, upped their annual income to 1,200 talents a year, rebuilt their fleet, restored their citizen hoplite army, and this was apparently true of all the Greek city-states. So in a very ironic way, as Alexander is winning this vast Asian empire and building upon all these royal institutions, he gives the Greeks their opportunity to recover at least some of their sense of morale and their finances. And shortly after Alexander's death, under the leadership of Athens, these Greek city-states would make their final challenge against the Macedonian overlord, only to find that the empire left by Alexander after his death just so outclasses the city-state that it really is a new Hellenistic world.